Well, folks, I am going to get us started here tonight as I want to be conscious of time. Again, welcome. My name is Sarah Paterka. I'm the Director of Opportunity St. Paul and some congregational engagement here at Interfaith Action. We've had a wonderful day already for Interfaith Action. We had our Bringing Faith to Life breakfast this morning, which you might recognize our celebrity presenter tonight, Dr. Uhuru Williams. He was our MC this morning, and it was wonderful. And so those of you who were at our breakfast, welcome back. You know, you started your day with us, you're closing your day with us. I love that. If you still want to see our breakfast video, it is available on our Facebook page and our website. We are so excited that you're with us tonight. Just a couple housekeeping things. We ask again, you stay on mute tonight. If you have questions, use the chat box. We've got some chats going right now already. We'll have a little time for Q&A before our Interfaith Text Study. And you'll recognize our Interfaith Text Study leader as well. We're welcoming back Wade Piper, joining us to be our text study. He was our amazing support staff, my amazing support staff from last year in Opportunity St. Paul, and we're excited to have him join us as well. So without further ado, I am going to pass it on over to Randy to introduce again our amazing speaker for the evening. So Randy, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. First of all, I just want to say welcome to everyone. There's so many people we haven't seen in a while, and people we saw just this morning. It's really exciting to see your faces. Thanks for all the notes you sent during the day after the program this morning. And if you didn't get to see it, I just want to echo what Sarah said. It's 24 minutes, soup to nuts, betraying my age. And it is fabulous. And so please take a look. Interfaith Action believes that equity and opportunity grow and poverty recedes when people of faith commit themselves to making a difference. Thank you to all of you for being a part of this work. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Uhuru Williams, the Distinguished University Chair and Professor and the founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. Dr. Williams is a nationally known author and commentator. He's the author and/or editor of 7 books, including Rethinking the Black Freedom Movement and The Black Panthers: Portraits of an Unfinished Revolution. Dr. Williams is not daunted by our challenges. He brings his full force to bear on making our opportunities become reality. He is our treasured partner for building equity and opportunity in St. Paul, and we are proud that he is a member of the Board of Directors of Interfaith Action of Greater St. Paul. Welcome, Uhuru.
Thank you so much, Randy. I appreciate it, and thanks for having me. And I am very proud to be on the board of Interfaith Action. When I first had the opportunity to meet you and was inspired by your vision and what you shared of the work of the organization, it seemed like a natural fit, but I've just been overwhelmed by the incredible work that Interfaith Action does, and incredibly inspired as I was today, and seeing that work in action through our community partners. So thank you to the board and to you, Randy, for the opportunity. And I hope to do it justice tonight with a talk that might take us down a little bit, although I do think we're in an opportunity moment of transformation. And I want to say that from the outset, because although we're talking about voter suppression, and it's easy in a conversation about voter suppression to perhaps feel like, I'm sorry, there we go. Can everybody see that? Great. It's easy in a conversation about voter suppression perhaps to become distracted and to feel like we're in a hopeless situation. But in fact, I would argue that when there are challenges to this degree, it is the opportune time for us to live the mission that Randy articulated to you in the very beginning. This is when people of faith can commit to do justice and can have a great impact as well. Historians like to, instead of giving a standard title, always take some phrase and turn that into the title. So even though this is not a book, I love this phrase, and it'll be, it comes from one of the cases we'll talk about tonight, but to that one, we ought to do justice, a brief history of voting and voter suppression in the United States. What we're going to talk about tonight, as you can see in the description, is to explore the history of voting suppression with particular attention to the historic restrictions placed on the suffrage for Indigenous people, immigrants, and African Americans, and the contemporary challenges to voter participation based on modern adaptations of these same restrictions, which, like vampires, continue to be resurrected and brought back to bear in our political process. I hope that in using that analogy of the vampire, we also understand that there's a way that we can think about killing these undead ideas, which continue to rob and erode the foundations of our democracy. I say that to you again because what I want to share tonight are stories of the familiar and the unfamiliar. And I want to do that around 5 major themes. I want to talk about how voter suppression has been used with regard to immigration, but perhaps not in the way that you're thinking about it tonight. I want to talk about voter suppression with regard to religion in the course of American history. Certainly going to talk about race, I'm going to talk about gender, and I'm going to talk about class. But this would not be an interfaith action program if I didn't also include the importance of allyship. And one of the themes that we'll explore this evening is how important allyship is in those moments when we are challenging any type of racial injustice, any type of injustice, period, but certainly racial or gender injustice, economic injustice, religious intolerance, and how important it is to cultivate and have good allies and for allies to stand up. I say that because in a way, I guess the foundational question for us tonight is, what is voter suppression? I think we all think that we know what it is. And the modern connotations of it really pivot around this idea that it is all about making access to voting difficult. We can see this in a number of manifestations: long lines, broken down machines, inadequate staffing, inadequate resources. Moving to Minnesota, to me, in many ways, to St. Paul, was a welcome change from Bridgeport, Connecticut, where I lived before this, where all the things that I just described were a regular feature of attempting to cast a ballot in an election. Bridgeport is a high poverty city. It's the city in which I was born, predominantly Black and Latino. To vote in 2016 for Hillary Clinton, at that time, I stood in line for more than 2 hours. Complained about it in that moment, but I also recognized how important it was for me to cast my ballot. But I also thought about all the people who I was in line with at that time, who were either having to miss work or negotiate time or to worry about picking up children, all to carry out what should be a fundamental attribute of citizenship, which often is made difficult for people to exercise by virtue of the disparate treatment of people of color, people in poor communities, people in urban centers, indigenous people, in efforts to restrict their access to suffrage. Now, I want to talk about a couple of things here just very quickly. We saw this in particular this election, this disparate treatment of absentee and provisional ballots county to county, the lack of transparency when officials count and report votes. And collectively, these injustices only serve to, as Fair Fight has written in 2020, and I'm just sharing this from them, further disfranchise already marginalized communities. In fact, Fair Fight goes on to say, systemic voter suppression, gross negligence, and erroneous administration from inadequately trained election officials prevented likely millions of eligible Americans all over the country from participating in 2018 midterm elections, corrupting their individual rights to vote and eroding democracy. What I love about that is that as we're looking at this and talking about what happened in 2018, we're also talking about this in the shadow of 2020 and what we saw less than 2 weeks ago, this unprecedented voter turnout in the United States, highest voter turnout since 1908. And now people calling into question, what is a moment to celebrate this massive participation by Americans to voice or make their voices heard in a presidential election. But Fair Fight concludes there are 3 fundamental stages of voting, which at any stage, voter suppression can be a problem. There is registration and efforts to dissuade, prevent, or obstruct people from being able to fulfill the prerequisites for registration. There's the question of access, This is particularly important when we talk about indigenous communities. So if polling places or the actual places where people cast their ballots are in remote areas or far removed from communities where there is not adequate access to transportation or other challenges, that in and of itself becomes a form of suppression. There's also the question of counting, which we're all now witnessing on a national scale in a way I hope that awakens in Americans a deep sense of the importance of us doing something in this moment to correct this issue. The reality is that every vote should count. We're hearing that mantra across the country, but we also have to talk about the challenge that we're getting from Washington, D.C. in the form of politicians who don't seem to abide by that fundamental principle and that fundamental attribute of American citizenship. Last but not least, Fair Fight says, with each passing stage and each successful voter suppression tactic, eligible voters are filtered out from the voting process, thereby reducing the number of people whose votes are counted. But I want to add something to Fair Fight's analysis here and say, it also has a chilling effect on future voters. If the narratives that we tell about our own encounters at the polls are negative, I remember my children, my son coming to me, this is the first national election that he voted in, and us talking at length about this, me wanting to be honest with him about my experiences at the polls and some of the challenges that I've had, but at the same time, not wanting to dissuade him from participation in this process out of a lack of convenience or other factors. And that's important as well. This is, as John Lewis argued, a sacred attribute of citizenship, and it's something that we should take very seriously. So voter suppression, we don't have the luxury of allowing voter suppression to scare us off from that duty. Having said that, let's get into this, what we want to talk about tonight. What has been the history of voter suppression? And I promised you stories familiar and unfamiliar. So I'm going to start with a story that should be familiar to you in some context, but also unfamiliar. And that is the question of immigration and voter suppression in the earliest days of our republic in the form of the Alien and Sedition Acts. So we know in 1789, Congress enacted 4 infamous laws, collectively known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. They were promoted by the Federalist Party then, and the goal of these Alien and Sedition Acts on the surface were to deal with this looming conflict between the United States and France, which at that point was in the midst of the French Revolution. There was this concern that the fiery revolutionary spirit which had erupted in France would corrupt the United States. But the reality is that the real concern was over the possibility that immigrants to the United States from France and elsewhere would support the views of the Jeffersonian Republicans, the opposition party to the then Federalist Party, while John Adams was in office. And these Alien and Sedition laws, particularly the Alien Acts, were designed as a form of voter suppression. They, for example, changed the residency requirement for individuals seeking to become naturalized citizens from 7 to 14 years. And at the time, many people recognized that for exactly what it was, an effort to prevent immigrant voters from swelling support for the Jeffersonian Republicans, whom they would have had more in kin with and would have found their policies much more attractive than what the Federalists could offer. This is pretty important because when we think about that jump in a residency requirement from 5 to 14 years and how significant that is, they weren't just cutting out those potential voters from the immediate election. They were also trying to cut them out from the subsequent election. And the reason I wanted to talk about this chapter first is it sets a context for how we really need to look into our history to understand that the roots of a lot of what we see today, because I see this as being part and parcel of a larger conversation about the Dreamers, a larger conversation about birthright citizenship, a larger conversation about other efforts at voter suppression, that they often don't deviate from the roots. And you can often tell because they telegraph their punches in terms of what the impulse is to deny individuals the right to vote. At that time, the Alien Act authorized the president to expel aliens, quote, dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States during peacetime. But how do you define that? In a lot of ways, it was granting this extreme amount of executive power to the president, but also at the same time, allowing the president to decry immigrants. In many cases, immigrants who had done nothing, but who were political enemies or who posed a threat to the Federalist Party to expel them from the United States. I can't help but see the shades of that moment and what we witnessed over the last 4 years in some of the discourse about immigrant communities in this country, and the fear over the way that the birthers and others might change politics in this country by virtue of swelling the ranks of a different class of voters. I say that to you with different issues and different concerns. I say that to you because, in a way, when we think about this across time and we look at this in the context of other efforts at alien acts, alien and sedition acts, they've always had this element of exclusion that has been baked into their bones. We can talk about this in terms of 1798 and the Alien Sedition Acts, which I just told you about. They were allowed to expire in Jefferson's first year in office in 1801. But I want to be clear, once the precedent had been set, it was something that was easy to return to. And we see that theme throughout US history. In 1882, as there are large numbers of Chinese immigrants moving to the United States, presumably to work on the railroads and for economic opportunity presented by the railroads and westward expansion, you see efforts to restrict the rights of Chinese to become citizens of the United States. Chinese Exclusion Act, for example, suspended Chinese immigration to the United States for 10 years, and at the same time barred Chinese who were already in the United States from becoming citizens. That is or was a form of voter suppression. If those individuals who had come had been allowed to vote or to become citizens and exercise their right to vote, very easily they could have tipped the balance in favor of politicians or policies that would have been more amenable and less restrictive, and certainly not racist at their core. We can look at this again as we move down and talk about it in terms of the 1907-1908 Gentlemen's Agreement between Japan and the United States, limiting Japanese immigration to the United States while allowing family members to join Japanese who were already US residents, but not necessarily citizens. That's problematic. We can talk about efforts at Alien Land Acts in California again. And remember, one of the prerequisites to citizenship was the ability to prove that one was a property holder or that had a stake in some sense in the larger society. And so this also is a form of voter suppression. And we can certainly talk about that as we look at the Dillingham Report, and then later on the efforts by Congress to deal with aliens during the First World War, which we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about, but I do want to mention that one of the devices that was used at that time was a literacy test, which was adapted from the same type of literacy test used to deprive African Americans of the right to vote in the aftermath of the Civil War. The playbook is the same. I want to be clear in talking about this because if we look at this in the larger context of that violence, in the larger context of that conversation, it wasn't just the deportation in these acts, but it was the unleashing of violence against these communities who were deemed to be either subversive, problematic, or alien. And there are abundant examples of that in American history that I can talk about, from the Alien and Sedition Acts, where people were tarred and feathered, down to what happens with the Haymarket Square riot in the United States, where there's this concern about immigrants coming to the United States with what they considered to be at that time alien political views and dangerous political views, and the violence against them in the same way. So we really need to talk about that and to think about that also in the context of this larger conversation. Having said that, when we also talk about threats and stories familiar and unfamiliar, I want to talk about religion and the efforts that were used to suppress votes based on religion. We sometimes forget that in several colonies, even after the Declaration of Independence, Jews, Quakers, and Catholics were sometimes denied the right to vote and barred from running and or holding public office solely on the basis of their faith. For example, Delaware, which I'm writing a book on now, in their Constitution of 1776, charged that every person who shall be chosen a member of either house or appointed to any office or place of trust, before taking his seat or entering upon the execution of his office, shall also make and subscribe to the following declaration, to wit: A, to profess faith in God the Father and in Jesus Christ, his Holy Son, and in the Holy Ghost, one God, blessed forevermore. And I do acknowledge the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. So you can see the ways in which that would have literally denied the participation of people from various faiths in the political process. I also want to be clear that while we think that the First Amendment would have addressed that, we also have to remember that the Bill of Rights only applies to the federal government, not the states. It's not going to be until 1868 in the 14th Amendment. In fact, it's not even in 1868. It's not until the 1940s where the Supreme Court will interpret selective incorporation of the Bill of Rights through the 14th Amendment to the states that the Bill of Rights will apply to the states. So the First Amendment's provision against Congress making no law that respected the establishment of religion didn't apply at the state level. And to be clear about that, what happens is that you have many states in the Union, including the state of Maryland, which denied Jews the right to vote. In fact, Maryland was the most infamous because it was the last state to remove that provision against Jewish voters. The reason I want to talk about this is that the bill itself is interesting because of the parallels that we can make not only to that earlier history, but in some sense today. The Jew bill, formally defined as, quote, an act to extend to the sect of people professing the Jewish religion the same rights and privileges enjoyed by Christians, was finally passed in 1826 by the Maryland General Assembly to allow Jews to hold public office in the state after a very long and very contentious politicized battle between Federalists and Republicans in that state. It resulted in the worst, or some of the worst examples of anti-Semitism that we can document in early American history. And if you have time to read about this chapter in American history, it's perhaps not shocking, but certainly disturbing, but reminds us of this long strain of anti-Semitism which runs through our history, which we should be talking about as we talk about the treatment of indigenous people, and certainly about the treatment of the enslaved Africans and later efforts to deny them their civil rights and civil liberties. I want to be clear that this new law that was passed in 1826 amended the state's Test Act, which was very similar to Delaware's law. And this allowed members of the Jewish faith for the first time to hold public office upon swearing. So it wasn't just a carte blanche grant. If you were Jewish, you still had to swear, quote, belief in the future state of rewards and punishments. In other words, you had to declare that you believed in an afterlife in order to be able to hold office and to vote. I'm going to think about how significant that is. Before this, the state's constitution had required public office holders to make, quote, a declaration of belief in the Christian religion. So it changes slightly, but some would argue not much. Now, this effort to change the law was led by two prominent Jewish businessmen, Jacob Cohen, who I couldn't find an image of, and Solomon Edding, who's pictured here. Edding also later ran and won a seat on the Baltimore City Council, becoming the first Jewish person to hold an elective office in Maryland. And while that's significant, and I want to talk about and privilege the work of the activists from that community who helped to secure that victory in 1826, they also had a very important ally in a champion in the legislature named Thomas Kennedy, himself a Christian who was deeply disturbed by what he saw as the unfair treatment of his Jewish brethren. After an earlier attempt to pass this, what became known as the Jew Bill, failed, which Kennedy had championed, he actually wrote a poem to the children of Israel in Maryland, in which he wrote, "I blush for Christians that they should forget the golden rule their great lawgiver set." And in noting the positive impact of Maryland's then small but influential Jewish community, including their service and defense of Fort McHenry during the War of 1812, he argued, quote, "There are few Jews in the United States. In Maryland, there are very few. But if there was only one, to that one, we ought to do justice." And I think that's a really powerful mantra in some sense, in the way that we're thinking about how we need to, particularly in the aftermath of this election, think about those on the margins, to that one, to those ones who continue to be vulnerable to the types of voter suppression that we're more familiar with today, but which again have their roots in this history that I'm sharing with you this evening. I also want to talk about this in the context of race. And certainly all of us are familiar with the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment is important because it establishes this principle of birthright citizenship, which we're going to talk about more in a minute. But the 15th Amendment is also significant because of the language and what it actually does. And many people have misconceptions even today about the purpose of the 15th Amendment and what the 15th Amendment accomplishes. In order to do that for you, I'm going to share a very brief video and I'll pick up on the other side. Hi, I'm Uhuru Williams. I'm a professor of history, and here's what you need to know to sound smart about the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment is the last of the so-called Civil War amendments, beginning with the 13th Amendment in 1865 and ending with the 15th Amendment in 1870. The three Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, all sought in their own ways to ensure equality for African Americans in the South after the Civil War. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted African Americans citizenship. The 15th Amendment outlawed discrimination in voting rights. Contrary to popular belief, the 15th Amendment does not grant the right to vote to anyone. It simply outlaws discrimination in voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Congress failed to provide enforcement for the amendment originally. Enforcement did not come until 1870 with the passage of the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. Interestingly, the first state to ratify the 15th Amendment was Nevada in March of 1869. The last state to ratify the amendment, Tennessee, in 1997. Although formally ratified in February of 1870, African Americans were still denied the right to vote by a variety of means by Southern states. These included things like the poll tax and literacy test. It would not be until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the majority of African Americans in the South were allowed to register to vote. So I saved myself a few minutes there, but I want to talk a little bit about what I shared last time when we were talking about the history of racial injustice in the United States. And I talked about the metaphor provided by Al Sharpton and the metaphor provided by Frederick Douglass with regard to the efforts that were made to restrict citizenship for African Americans. But I want to focus specifically here on the poll tax, literacy test, and grandfather clause, all as efforts to restrict African American voting in the South. The poll tax in requiring that African Americans pay their taxes up until the point, pay their taxes in full at the point that they wanted to vote, certainly disfranchised large numbers of African American voters or potential African American voters. The literacy test, a device that I've talked about briefly already, was another mechanism to do this. And the grandfather clause, infamous, which was first levied in 1866, also had the same function, basically declaring that if your relative, your grandfather, had not voted in the state prior to January 1st, 1866, then you were in perpetuity ineligible to vote in that state. These were all insidious efforts to undermine African American voting in the South. But I also want to point out, they all persisted well into the 20th century. The poll tax is not done away with until the 24th Amendment. The grandfather clause will not be vanquished until the case of Gwynn versus Oklahoma in 1915. And the literacy test, again, is really only challenged by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we have to talk about the long history of these devices. I also want to be clear that in the same way that we talked about violence earlier, violence and intimidation toward African Americans who were trying to exercise their right to vote was a common feature. I share two quick cartoons here, the one on the left and the one on the right from the Richmond Whig, One Less Vote, showing an African American killed for trying to vote. You can see Ku Klux Klan etched on the tombstone that's there. But I also want to share an even more disturbing cartoon from Harper's Weekly from October 1879. And this is the great cartoonist Thomas Nast. And he depicts this image of a skeleton labeled Solid Southern Shotgun at a polling station, holding a shotgun with one foot standing atop a glass bowl labeled Suffrage and Liberty. Surrounding him were dead bodies, including one labeled, and again, I apologize for the language here, but I think when we do the work of historical recovery, we have to deal with the language that was used at that time. And I want to draw attention to the fact that, and I'm not being partisan, but I think you need to say this in this moment, during the debates when our current occupant of the White House made the comment about the Proud Boys, stand ready, a lot of people heard in the echoes of that language, this moment and this type of violence and this is what it meant to watch the polls. And who were you watching the polls from? And if you read the other things that Thomas Nast has peppered on the handbills around the skeleton, You can see messages that mock the very idea of free elections in the South. Now, again, this is 1879 in the aftermath of this watershed moment that should have meant an opportunity for liberty. And you'll see that Nast is playing with the history here too. 1775 to 1776, the mantra of the United States was give me liberty or give me death. From 1879 to 1880, Nast is saying it's death to liberty. I mean, the power of this in the moment that we're in right now. Over the skeleton's head, brute might makes right. Shoot suffrage to death. Is government of the people, for the people, by the people, to be shot to death. So we need to understand this again in this much longer context of this history that continues to inform our contemporary moment. I say that too because when we talk about the long shadow of violence against African Americans, I just want to give you 3 brief examples here. On the far left, this is an article from 1896, not from the United States, but from Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, reported through the London press. It talks about an election agent assassinated, Negro voters killed in Alabama. Again, it's not a history that we talk about often, but the point I'm trying to make here is that in each one of these elections, and I literally could have done this every election cycle, including the midterm elections, there was this type of violence in the United States against people of color, namely African Americans, but depending on where you were in the country, Mexicans, Chinese, Japanese, and indigenous people were all subject to this level of violence. In February of 1956, civil rights probe asked in Mississippi, this is from the Baltimore Sun, after there were reports of Black voters being killed. 1920, this is from actually 2002, but it was people who lived in Orlando, Florida, recalling election day violence that took place in that city 82 years before that left 8 people dead. When we spent this summer talking about the Tulsa race riot of 1921 and the Duluth lynching of 1920, it's interesting that they were all part and parcel of a period of violence that begins with the Red Summer of 1919 that extends into 1920. In fact, some argue you can go back to the East St. Louis, deadly East St. Louis violence in 1917 that's somewhat interrupted by America's entry into the First World War, but then reaches a crescendo and an orgy of violence against Black people, particularly around exercising their constitutional rights to vote. I want to give you one last example of this, at least with regard to race, and that's by talking about a gentleman who unfortunately didn't get a lot of attention this summer when he passed, but Reverend C.T. Vivian, one of Martin Luther King's chief lieutenants in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a good friend of John Lewis, somebody who also passed this summer. And I want to play for you briefly an encounter that C.T. Vivian, very infamous, but also at the same time empowering encounter that C.T. Vivian had in Dallas County, Alabama, with the then sheriff, Jim Clark, to just illustrate again the echoes of this violence and this voter suppression and how it's impacted the African-American community.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us? We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street. Is what I'm saying true? Is it what you think and what you believe?
On February 15th, 1965, civil rights leader C.T. Vivian led a group of 40 marchers to the Dallas County Courthouse in Selma, Alabama, hoping to register the followers to vote. On that cold, rainy morning in Selma, Alabama, Vivian and the 40 marchers were met with the type of opposition that civil rights workers had been facing for years, this time in the form of Sheriff Jim Clark.
And we want you to know, gentlemen, that every one of you, we know your badge numbers, we know your name.
I'm really telling him right. And he got upset, but he knew better than to lose he was the kind of guy to lose his temper and just beat people, right? And, but the cameras were on him from all over the world, right?
But you're racist in the same way that Hitler was a racist. And you're blindly following a man that's leading you down a road that's going to bring you into federal court.
He turned his back on me and he humped his shoulders up and tried to walk away from me. But I came right behind him and I said, you can turn your back on me, Sheriff Clark, but you can't turn your back on the concept of justice. And he dropped, his shoulders dropped, and he looked over his shoulder at me as if to say, how do you get rid of this, right? And he said, turn that light on.
Turn that light on. I can't enforce the law of light. We have come to register.
Turn that light out, right? Well, Well, see, that was so he could hit me without being seen. All right. The idea was to take away the cameras. The cameras was real evidence, right?
And this is our reason for being here. We're not blinding me with that light. We're not move back.
But then he was telling the guys to turn out the lights. And when they turned out the lights, that's when he hit me. But the important thing there was that I got up.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us? Why don't you get out in front of the camera and go on? It's not a matter of being in front of the camera. It's a matter of facing your sheriff and facing your judge. We're willing to be beaten for democracy. And you misuse democracy in the street. If we're wrong,
I absolutely love that video for so many reasons, because you can actually see the blood, even though it's in black and white, dripping from Reverend Vivian's mouth, and yet he still stood up and confronted Sheriff Clark. You also hear Sheriff Clark say at one point to the reporters, "Turn that light out. I can't enforce the law with the light in my face," which I think is an important mantra for our moment as well, but very telling. But I also want to talk about allyship here too, and the importance of allyship, because in this moment in our history, we do well to remember Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney. But I want to talk particularly about Goodman and Schwerner tonight, and the other young students, white students, and in this case, 2 Jewish students, who went south to help register African Americans to vote, to participate in voter education as part of the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer Project. As you will recall, these 3 men were murdered by bodies discovered in an earthen dam in Philadelphia, Mississippi on June 21st, 1964, after they were bailed out of prison in the middle of the night and effectively murdered, lynched by state officials who were also members of the Ku Klux Klan. I mention this because in a lot of ways, this is an important, perhaps, well, I'll say it the way that I feel it. This is an important reminder that we can look at C.T. Vivian, and I feel fortunate that he was alive and lived to tell the tale, but the consequences for this level of violence were real, and certainly real for these individuals. And it's important for us to think about what compelled Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner to give so freely of themselves in that moment, because one could argue it wasn't their fight, and yet I think they were practicing the principle of tikkun olam, repairing the world, by putting themselves in that position to be a part of that. It's why we celebrate their lives today, along with James Chaney. I'll also be clear that in that moment, because Michael Schwerner's wife, Rita, is now widowed by virtue of the fact that he's been killed in this way. When President Lyndon Johnson went on television and sent flowers to Rita Schwerner and mentioned the 2 white civil rights workers, but not James Chaney, Rita Schwerner used that as a moment, as what I like to call a Black Lives Matter moment. And she called out the president. She called it out. She said, "My husband, Michael Schwerner, did not die in vain. If he and Andrew Goodman had been Negroes, the world would have taken little notice of their deaths. After all, the slaying of a Negro in Mississippi is not news. It's only because my husband and Andrew Goodman were white that the national alarm has been sounded." I think sometimes it's really important for us to look at allyship in action, to understand what allyship really is. Again, just a powerful moment, but I also was thinking about this while I was watching the testimonials about Interfaith today during the breakfast. This is the work that we do together because we recognize our shared humanity and the fact that we're dependent on one another, and rights lost for anyone are ultimately dangerous to us all. As I mentioned in the beginning, from the case from Maryland, if it's only one, that in and of itself is a problem, is a challenge. Moving on from this, and again, very important to note that allyship there. When we think about gender, and I want to continue with this theme of familiar and unfamiliar stories, gender and voter suppression. On Saturday night, Kamala Harris gave a phenomenal speech in which she invoked the memory of the struggle for women to gain the right to vote, to be able to vote unencumbered by laws which denied them that right based on gender. At the same time, I want to be clear, if we think about that, and we think about that in terms of pre-Civil War and how women experience this denial, one of my favorite documents is Frances Willard, who recorded in her journal in 1856 how she felt as a young girl being denied the right to vote. And I want to share this with you because in a way, I think this is why Van Jones broke down crying after the election results were read, because we all should remember and would do well to remember the impact that it has on young people when they see the frustration of the processes or the mechanisms of our government, and when they see the lack of humanity in their fellow citizens. But I want to share this with you because I think it's powerful. She wrote this in 1856 in her diary. "This is election day, and my brother is 21 years old. How proud he seemed as he dressed up in his best Sunday clothes and drove off in the big wagon with father and the hired men to vote for John C. Fremont, like the sensible free soiler that he is. My sister and I stood at the window and I looked out after them. Somehow I felt a lump in my throat and then I could not see the wagon anymore. Things got so blurred. I turned to Mary and she, dear little innocent, seemed so wonderfully sober. And I said, wouldn't you like to vote as well as Oliver? Don't you and I love the country just as well as he does? And doesn't the country need our ballots? Then she looked scared, but answered in a minute. Of course we do. Of course we ought. But don't you go ahead and say so, for then we'd be called strong-minded. So we can even see how gender convention in that moment reinforced the patent unfairness, undemocratic nature of those laws which were denying women the ability, the opportunity to participate. But I also want to point out here, and it's not to, Frances Willard, like many people in history, was a complicated figure. But I want to point out here also that she makes this distinction between her father and brother and the hired men. And there's a hierarchy here too, this belief that somehow as part of the elite, she should have been allowed to participate in the process. And I want to talk about this because this is in some sense the importance of understanding when allyship sometimes goes wrong. Let me give you a good example of this by saying that, as I pointed out, the 15th Amendment does not confer the right to vote on anyone, but it did not specifically say that gender was outlawed. And so that, of course, allowed the states to make that decision. And many states obviously continue to disfranchise women. In response, you have some of the people that we lionize associated with the women's suffrage movement, not thinking about, because, and I want to be clear about this, there was a powerful alliance between abolitionists and the women's movement extending back into the 1830s and 1840s. People like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass worked closely with the leaders of the women's suffrage movement. And this was a very powerful alliance which disintegrates in the shadow of the looming adoption of the 15th Amendment. You can see that in a speech that's delivered by Elizabeth Cady Stanton in April of 1869, where after women, it becomes clear that women are not going to get the right to vote and that gender is not going to be outlawed, that she lashes out and she writes, American women of wealth, education, virtue, and refinement, if you do not wish the lower orders of Chinese, Africans, Germans, and Irish with their low ideas of womanhood to make laws for you and your daughters, to be your rulers, judges, jurors, to dictate not only the civil, but moral codes by which you shall be governed. Awake to the danger of your present position and demand that women too shall be represented in the government. Of course, I don't need to point out to anyone here, as I have on other occasions, that the reality is that it wasn't the lower orders of Chinese, Africans, Germans, and Irish that had denied women the right to vote. It was the husbands, brothers, fathers, and sons who were in positions of power, who overlooked their wives, daughters, and mothers in passing this legislation. But I also want to be clear that this resort to racial scapegoating and what it represents in that moment and how it continues to present a danger for us today is what we should also be cognizant of as we talk about the importance of allyship. In fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton didn't stop there. In December of 1868, she wrote, and I wanted to have this tapestry here of Black women and Native women and Mexican women and all the women who would have been discounted by virtue of immigrants of the statement that she was making. Think of Patrick and Sambo and Hans and Young Tongue, who do not know the difference between a monarchy and a republic, who never read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's spelling book, making laws for Lydia Marie Child, Lucretia Mott, or Fanny Kimball. Think of jurors drawn from these ranks to try young girls for the crime of infanticide. You can understand her frustration, but I want to point this out, not to single her out, because certainly we could do this with all the problematic figures that we deal with in history. We are talking about human beings and human frailty, but simply to note that in this moment where that alliance should have been much greater and much stronger, it descended into the scapegoating, which certainly hurt the women's movement. The person who responds to her, and I realize I've shared this before, but for those who haven't seen me talk about this, and I talked about this last night at a presentation at Lourdes, is an African-American female leader named Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who actually is writing in 1866 before Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But she's also writing in response to this concern that women will not be enfranchised by virtue of this new legislation. And she writes, "I do not believe that giving the woman the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I think that like men, they may be divided into three classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent." I've shared this on many occasions, but what I love about this is that I think that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper is talking to us today. And she continues, "The good would vote according to their convictions and principles. The bad is dictated by prejudice or malice, and the indifferent will vote on the strongest side of the question with the winning party. You white women speak of rights, I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in the situation of Ishmael, my hand against every man and every man's hand against me." I want to point out there that she's expressing this deep wound about the fracture of that alliance in that moment, and that somehow, rather than recognizing the shared interest and the shared concern, the shared desire to ensure the right to vote for all Americans, regardless of race, class, or gender, instead of dealing with that issue, you saw this appeal to class and to race that was coming out of leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And that's important for us to know in terms of allyship. At the same time, when we're talking about race, the 14th and 15th Amendments, and the principle of one man, one vote, we also have to talk about birthright citizenship and how that's impacted conversations about immigration and continues to do so even today. Take for note this tweet from number 45 from October of 2018. "So-called birthright citizenship, which cost our country billions of dollars and is very unfair to our citizens, will be ended one way or another. It's not covered by the 14th Amendment because the word subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Many legal scholars agree." Actually, they don't. And the thing that was really important about that moment is if you look at the image underneath, that whole birther craze began, as you can see there in this very ugly billboard, demanding Barack Obama's birth certificate because of the fact that he was Kenyan. And that was the argument then, of course, which was ridiculous. But that whole concern and that whole craze. When you do that, it's a very short walk to the conversations we're having about children in cages, because the rampant nature of the rhetoric that denies the very humanity of the individuals that we're talking about allows rhetoric and this type of hatefulness to become policy. And we've seen the destructive impact of that over the last 4 years. That's what people, in some sense, need to think about as we're talking about voting going forward in this larger conversation about birthright citizenship. By the way, to be clear, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution does establish birthright citizenship. As James Ho has written in American Birthright Citizenship in the original understanding of the 14th Amendment, the citizenship clause was no legal innovation. It simply restored the longstanding English common law doctrine of jus soli, or citizenship by place of birth. Although the doctrine was initially embraced in early American jurisprudence, the US Supreme Court abrogated jus soli in its infamous Dred Scott decision, denying birthright citizenship to the descendants of slaves. I want to amend that a little bit, and I want to connect that to the familiar and unfamiliar stories that I told you earlier. In fact, the first attempt to abrogate it, in some sense, came around what was happening with Jews who would have been born in the United States, or Catholics or Quakers who would have been disfranchised by virtue of their faith. So again, this historical recovery is essential to us understanding the playbook so we can think about ways that we can be good allies and challenge this inequality. Also want to talk about this in terms of what happened this election in terms of conversations about birthright citizenship. Anna Smith in the Highland County News on November 6th wrote, how Indigenous voters swung the 2020 election in numerous key states, but the most important she talked about were Arizona and Wisconsin. She wrote, "This year's presidential election has been a close race in a handful of states, including Arizona. On Wednesday, for just the second time in 70 years, the Associated Press called the race for a Democratic presidential candidate, in part due to the native vote. Indigenous people in Arizona comprised nearly 6% of the population." She goes on to talk about the impact they had on the vote. I want to be clear that while we can assume that in the next election, that should translate into people thinking about how they craft a message that speaks to the issues of Indigenous people in Arizona, more than likely what we will see are efforts to adopt policies and practices that will deny Indigenous people the opportunity to exercise their right to vote. And that's what we have to be concerned about, that at the core, this has always been the impulse, not to welcome and celebrate the expansion of the electorate, but to find ways to discount these elements of the population. And I don't say that lightly, because when we think about this with regard to Indigenous people, we can look at the 1884 infamous case of John Elk versus Charles Wilkins, in which a native-born Native American born in the United States, the Supreme Court determined could be denied the right to vote. Justice Horace Gray wrote for the 7-2 majority in that case, observing that the question is whether an Indian born a member of one of the Indian tribes within the United States is merely by reason of his birth within the United States and of his afterwards voluntarily separating himself from his tribe and taking up his residence among white citizens, a citizen of the United States within the meaning of the first section of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. I hope, because I don't have time to talk about this in detail, in fact, I'm running short on time now, that you can all see the paradox of this question that Gray is posing. Gray argued that the answer to that question was no. In fact, he goes on to say that the majority tribal members owed immediate allegiance to their several tribes and were not part of the people of the United States. They were, in his words, a dependent condition, a state of pupillage, resembling that of a ward to his guardian. So that language around birtherism, that language around denying people the right to vote, the only way that a Native person, by virtue of this decision, could become an American citizen was through the naturalization process, even though they're the Indigenous people, points to not only the irony and paradox of these types of laws, but the legal gymnastics and faulty reasoning that esteemed jurists were willing to go to in order to ensure the suppression of that vote and the suppression of their participation in the political process. I want to be clear that one person who dissents here is Justice John Marshall Harlan. It's part of the reason that we celebrate him as the great dissenter. I wish I had time to read that dissent to you, but I would commend that you take a look at it. It is pretty impressive, as are all of Harlan's dissents. But I want to talk about that as a familiar pattern, because I hope at this point through these stories, familiar and unfamiliar, what we see is this pattern, this playbook. By the time Native Americans are finally granted full citizenship on June 2nd, 1924, by virtue of the Indian Citizenship Act, I want to be clear that the right to vote was not baked into that act. It was still governed by state law. And so what you saw in the immediate aftermath of the Indian Citizenship Act was the fact that Native peoples were still denied the right to vote in many states, including Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Maine, all of which continued to bar natives from voting in elections. In 1948, Native Americans in New Mexico and Arizona successfully sued to get the right to vote. Utah and North Dakota became the last states to afford on-reservation Native Americans the right to vote in 1957 and 1958. I want you to think about how long that took and why that's significant. I also want to point out that this continued well into the 1970s. So case cited here, in Arizona, Native Americans could not fully participate in voting until 1970, when the Supreme Court upheld a ban against literacy tests in that moment. And that's important to note as well. When we mention all of that, all of these things inform our conversation about our contemporary challenges. And they do so in a way that should remind us of the fact that we need to be vigilant. The fact that President Trump, President Trump didn't understand or the history of the 14th Amendment or the meaning of that language is significant. But at the same time, we can make a joke out of it, but it's actually something that we should be very concerned about in this moment. In fact, Patty Ferguson-Bohnen wrote about this in February of last year, how the Native American vote continues to be suppressed. And she did this for the American Bar Association in a fascinating article. She wrote, in order to understand the challenges faced by Native American voters, one must recognize the vast differences in experiences, opportunities, and realities facing on-reservation voters as compared to off-reservation voters. This is a question of access, and it's a critical question. In fact, she gives us this great story here that illustrates her point. I will never forget the Navajo grandmother who spoke only Navajo and who could not vote after Arizona passed its voter ID law in 2004. She tried several times to obtain an Arizona ID on her own, but was denied because she was born at home in Hogan, and the boarding schools changed her Navajo name to English. I want all of us to see the insidious ways that this continues to impact Indigenous people and how by extension would also impact Latinos and African Americans. The great connector here, which we'll talk about in just a second, is poverty and access, and that has to be part of our conversation as well. I love the rest of this, so I'm going to share it with you even though I'm short on time. She lived in a modest home on the Navajo reservation without electricity and running water, and lived a traditional lifestyle taking care of her sheep. She was embarrassed and devastated when she was turned away from the polls for not having an ID. Working with her, a team from the Indian Legal Clinic traveled 5 hours to meet her at multiple agency offices to obtain her delayed birth certificate. We then went to 2 separate motor vehicle division offices. The first one did not issue same-day photo IDs, and the other initially denied her request. At every turn, what we're seeing here is a modern manifestation of how voter suppression works in the most insidious ways to deny American citizens the right to vote. Last part of this, which I think is fascinating. The office rejected her delayed Navajo birth certificate until I was able to intervene and demonstrate to them that it was an acceptable document. This is why we need services like Interfaith offers with regard to legal support for vulnerable communities. I mean, this speaks to the work in this community as powerfully as it speaks to this circumstance from Arizona that Bohnen's talking about. But she concludes, the system failed to consider her reality as a Navajo woman and failed to value her as a voter. I'd go one step further, which is appropriate to the mission of Interfaith. It failed to value her as a human being. Fortunately, Bohnen continues, she was persistent in exercising her right to vote, but not all voters are, nor should they have to be. And I think that's our marching orders as we think about what comes next for us in the aftermath of the election of 2000. If I were to talk about very briefly, and I only have 3 slides left, the 3 major impediments facing Indigenous voters right now. Bohnen did a great job of identifying these for us. Non-traditional addresses, voter registration, large writ, and voter ID laws. Now, again, these are the same for Latinos, same for African Americans, same for the Hmong and Somali. Access to in-person polling locations and vote by mail movement. We saw what happened this year with regard to that. We need to gear up going forward to think about facilitating the process of voting by mail and perhaps think about leveraging technology as some states have done, like Texas already, to facilitate voting even more. And then the necessity of Congress to actually pass a Native American Voting Rights Act. And the reason that that's argued is necessary is that Native Americans were actually covered under the Civil Voting Rights Act of 1965, but when the US Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder undercut the key sections of that act, it not only hurt African Americans, it also hurt Native voters and non-English speaking voters. I want to point out to everybody, this is why this historical recovery is so important. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. In 1975, the first time voting materials in this country were offered in various languages was due to an amendment to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that required election officials to print in multiple languages besides English to ensure the participation. That's 1975. I want to end with you tonight by showing you a very brief video from ABC News from this summer that kind of sums up the challenges. It's about 4 minutes, and then I will conclude, and I'll turn it back over to Randy. Of course, we're going to be forced to watch a commercial. I apologize for that.
With FlexPath from Capella University, courses are online and on demand to put you in control of your education. Set your own deadlines and move at your own pace. You can even finish the bachelor's degree you started in 12 months for $10,000. Capella University. Don't just learn, learn smarter.
Taking a look at a big Black Lives Matter banner right next to St. John's Church there in Washington, D.C. Welcome back to our special here. And slavery is not abolished until the Black man has the ballot. Those words were spoken by Frederick Douglass back in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. And now here we are in 2020, heading towards another presidential election, arguably one of the most pivotal in generations. And as we've already seen in the primary season, the right of the Black man and woman to vote is still not a guarantee.
Are we fired up?
Activist, let's.
Apparently I'm not sharing my screen, so give me just a second. I apologize. I don't know why you can't see that, but what I'm going to do, because we're running out of time, I will have, I'll share that video. Can everybody see my screen now?
No, Uhuru.
Okay, let me try this. I will share that video separately because it'll probably take too long to figure this out. So I will share that. Where I would end with you then tonight is just on what I shared earlier, which is that the one piece that we can't lose in this entire equation is talking about the importance of poverty. If you look at voter turnout by family income from 2016, you can see in a very clear way the way in which poverty influences this conversation. And it's a stark reminder of what the Reverend Dr. King wrote in his final book, Chaos, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? What good is it to have the right to eat in a restaurant if you can't afford anything on the menu? We really have to address the economic components of this conversation as well. But at the end of the day, when we come down to it, really it is the importance of allyship that has made all the difference. This idea that we can take of tikkun olam or repairing the world. And I just would reiterate what Randy shared with you from the very beginning. When people of faith commit themselves to making a difference, really incredible things can happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Uhuru. That was wonderful. And we will we'll share that link. You can maybe share it in the chat, Uhuru, or else we'll share it via email to all of those who registered. We are going to keep moving in the evening. If you do have questions, feel free to send them in the chat or send me an email later on and we will forward them on to Uhuru, who, there's the link, everyone, is always gracious to communicate with us via email, and we can always get those back to you. But tonight, it's fun to invite back Wade Piper to join us. And Wade is a recent alumni of Hamline University and a current student at Luther Seminary studying justice and reconciliation. Like I said earlier, Wade is a former staff member of Interfaith Action of both Opportunity St. Paul and Project Home. And he was just a great addition to our staff last year. And it's so exciting to have you come and present for Interfaith Text Study tonight. So Wade, take it away.
Awesome. Everybody can hear me all right, right? Awesome. I always like to check. It just makes it go easier. So yeah, thanks for having me back. It's so exciting to see familiar faces. I see a couple names of folks who I didn't get to meet, and I'm just excited that there's new faces coming around as well. I am going to figure out how to share my screen, and then we will go ahead and get started here. So, are you able to see my screen all right? All right, I'm getting thumbs up from Sarah and Randy. All right, so yes, for our Interfaith Text Study tonight, I am coming to you as a Lutheran man, and I am going to be talking to you about Paul's letter to the Romans. So I will read out this verse. I will give you a moment to perhaps reread it. I've added some emphasis to some parts I'm highlighting in our conversation tonight, and then we will get into it. So I will go ahead and read this out for us. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body, we have many members, and not all the members have the same function. So we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually we are members of one another. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us: prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, and the compassionate in cheerfulness. So I'll invite you to take a couple moments, reread things that stood out to you. I'm going to leave it up as I speak for a little bit here before we go out into conversation, but I'll give you just a moment to reread anything you'd like to read. To say a quick word on why I picked this verse, and why I think that this is a good topic for our conversation tonight. I wanted to focus on something that I thought we could share in conversation that would be informative in thinking in our own experiences in our own lives, but also relating to your volunteer work. My background working with OSP helps me to know that you all are engaging in a lot of great volunteer opportunities. Some of you are working at our nonprofit partners, engaging in our community in a really wonderful and impactful way. And I wanted to pick something that I think has something to say about the work that we're doing in our community here in the Twin Cities. And this verse comes to me from my background. My background is in outdoor ministry. I've worked at Luther Crest Bible Camp in Alexandria, Minnesota for the past 5 summers in various roles. And I get to engage with students and kids that are my campers at this really awesome and difficult and insecure and unique and wonderful time in their lives, where they're going through school, they're navigating the really complex social lives and like learning that comes with being a kid. And a lot of the kids I'm experiencing are at this point in life where they're trying to figure out where they fit. They're asking questions about what their role is supposed to be in their lives, in their communities. And I think in a lot of the volunteer experiences that I know Opportunity St. Paul volunteers do, you're working with students, you're working with adult learners who are similarly on a journey of learning and coming to a place where they're looking to expand their education and find the fit that comes with being an adult learner. You're working with job seekers who are also coming from this place of questions, of seeking a place and a role for themselves. And in this, when I'm working with kids who are asking these questions, I found this verse can be very helpful. It's helpful for me when I'm talking to kids who are asking questions of fit, role, how to make an impact in their communities, because that's something that drives a lot of students, children that I work with. And these are questions that we all ask. These all of us, young or old, will come to a time in our lives where there's a significant change, and we're looking for a role in this new community we're a part of. And in this verse, I think we see the Apostle Paul develops a framework for understanding our roles as individuals and the communities we're a part of. Paul here is speaking specifically about communities of faith. And what Paul tells us is that we are able to take part in these communities, strengthen these communities, and glorify God through the peculiarities in ourselves, the things that make us unique, the things that are uniquely our gifts and talents. For as in one body, we have many members, and not all members have the same function. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. And we see prophecy in proportion to faith, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation. And if we take a step back, we can apply this to beyond just our communities of faith, our community here in the Twin Cities. You know, you could continue this list that we get at the end of verse 8. The leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness, the activist in their activism. Things such as that, inserting things like this that help us apply this framework to our own lives. So that's what I want our conversation to focus on. I want us to take this framework of relating ourselves as individuals to the communities we're a part of through our own gifts and talents, the things that make us unique. And I want us to look at the communities we are a part of and your lived experiences and see how that bears out, how that plays out. So that's part of what our conversation is going to focus on. I also want to flip this on its head a little bit, and I want us to think that of how when this framework isn't applied, when we aren't coming into these communities from a place of working from our unique gifts and talents, where that can lead to some struggles, because I think that there are just communities and institutions we're a part of in our lives where we're asked to do things that are kind of outside our zone of comfort. I guess what I mean to say is, where have we seen struggles born out of pressure for perhaps every individual to complete the exact same job in the exact same way that doesn't make any room for expression of their own unique gifts and talents? As Paul says in a different letter, his first letter to the Corinthians, if the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole body were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? Or if you prefer a secular quote, often attributed to Albert Einstein, but who knows who it's actually from, everyone is a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. So we are going to go into some breakout rooms, and Sarah is going to post these in the chat, because once we go into breakout rooms, you won't be able to see these. But we're going to talk about some of these questions. Sarah, would you be, either you or I can also post perhaps the verse so that it's easily accessible. But I'd like you to start your conversations just by talking about how you think about this framework Paul lays out. Do you think it's helpful? I think the best way to start a conversation like this is to just evaluate it right out of the gate and figure out if you like it or not. Then we're going to apply this to our communities where we've seen this framework implemented positively, or perhaps where we haven't seen it, where we haven't seen unique gifts and talents being brought to the forefront of what our roles are in communities. And finally, I want you to talk about your volunteer experiences. That's one of the things that brings us together here, that unites us. How can you relate these ideas present in this verse to both yourself in your volunteer experiences, but also the people with whom you work, students, job seekers, adult learners, anyone else I may be forgetting in my little mini list right here. But anyway, I would love for us to break out into some breakout rooms and discuss this for a little bit, and then we will bring it back to the big group.
Perfect. I'm going to assign people into big breakout rooms, so just accept that, please. We're only going to go for about 5 minutes, so we're going to keep it moving quick. So breakout rooms, just accept it, and then we'll call you back. We're going to get started. Wade, you can continue on. Share any closing thoughts and that poem for you.
Awesome. So I would just love to hear if anyone had any particular insights they'd like to share before we wrap up here. I would love to hear what you talked about. I know it can be intimidating, but just go for it.
And feel free to unmute yourself and just share.
Yeah, for sure.
One of the things we talked about is the risk in any group of typecasting people and kind of locking them into, you know, whatever position they started with in the group, and not really letting people explore new gifts or grow gifts that they have that maybe aren't evident.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It is really, really interesting as you grow. Like, yeah, your gifts change, and you find yourself in new roles and called to do new things, and creating space for that, especially when working with young people, in my experiences, is incredibly important.
I love the part about we are members of one another, and in the distinction about our gifts, we are members of one another. And so if we can focus on whether that's someone we're mentoring or whatever, like knowing them as a neighbor, and they may not look like us, they may have different economic circumstances, but first and foremost, and we've talked about so many times at our learning community events about trust and about trusted adults. And yeah, we do tend to be older in many cases when we're in our volunteer capacities than those who we're working with, that we can learn from them, and they're our neighbors. So I love the part in the passage, Wade, about we are members of one another, and then to look at our gifts that way and to try to see what those are and how we can blend those to get to a desired result, which might be reading or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the beautiful things that you are pointing to in this kind of framework for building community out of the uniqueness of individuals is just how relational that community is, and how fundamentally relationship based it is. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing.
Wade?
Yes, Earl.
Good evening. It's wonderful to see you, and thank you for your teaching, Wade. Wade, it seems to me it's likely that Paul was taking those parts of the body metaphors from Plato. And when Plato used them, he used them against democracy. Our challenge is, and this I think builds on what Jill said, is to find a way to understand those kinds of organic differences in harmony with democratic equality. That's a particular challenge. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for your insight, Earl. It's wonderful to see you as well.
Thank you, Wade.
Is there any other thoughts from the small groups that folks would like to share? Otherwise, I have one thing to wrap us up, and then I can throw it back to Sarah or Randy to do any final housekeeping and anything like that. I am going to quickly read something I like to do to close things out that I'm participating in. It's a poem by my favorite spiritual poet, Rumi, who is a Sufi poet. And I will just read it quickly, and then I will throw it back to Sarah or Randy. Rise up nimbly and go on your strange journey to the ocean of meanings. The stream knows it can't stay on the mountain. Leave and don't look away from the sun as you go, in whose light you're sometimes crescent and sometimes full. So that is something I like to center myself on as we leave this place and go back out into our lives, and do the wonderful work you're all doing. Thank you for having me. It was wonderful to be back. And Sarah or Randy, you can take it away.
Thank you, Wade. I will take it from here. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you to Dr. Uhuru Williams and to Wade and all of our participants. It's always just a joy to be with you on these nights as we learn together, as we grow together, as we be community together. Again, everything that you need is on our website. If you want to see the Bringing Faith to Life breakfast video, it should be on the front page there. We'd love for you to watch it and share it with those folks on social media that you follow or other ways. And if you need something from us, please feel free to email or call us. We hope you are enjoying your volunteer opportunities. There are more volunteer opportunities available virtually that are COVID safe. So feel free to get in touch with me if you want to do more, want to change your partnership, or want to find something different to do. So we appreciate you all, and we hope to see you in December. So thank you, and be well and stay healthy, everyone. Have a wonderful night.